Meet Sawyer, a Honduran milk snake. This isn't my snake, but somehow I ended up with the task of making him a naturalistic home, and I kinda wish I hadn't. In the process, I designed and built a custom stand and canopy, created a front opening vivarium, sculpted realistic features from concrete, and designed a setup to practically and aesthetically recreate the tropical rainforest, showcasing this beautiful gem of the jungle here in Pennsylvania. That's all good and well, but I can't think of many projects that have tested my patience quite like this one. I genuinely think it was cursed because it was plagued by one problem after another. You'll see what I mean. Join me as I share how I struggled through this build. As the name suggests, these snakes originate from tropical areas in Honduras, as well as Nicaragua and Costa Rica. They inhabit various environments, including rainforests, which is where I derived inspiration. Locations full of leaf litter around trees, stumps, and other similar features are what I had in mind. However, there's something he'd naturally encounter that I've never made before: buttress roots. Many trees in tropical areas grow like this to provide stability in poor soil conditions. I knew these would make for a compelling design, so I seized the opportunity. Before I could do that, I had to build an enclosure, which was easy enough. The only thing is that I lost most of the original footage. Luckily, my wife had taken some cell phone clips that I was able to stitch together with footage from similar tank builds for the sake of demonstration. The shell from an old tank was the foundation I'd build from, though it needed to be modified. First, I cleaned the new pieces to remove any oil or debris, then taped off the edges to create clean silicone beads. This design uses full depth sides to hold the doors in place, so the stock panels had to go. New silicone won't stick to old silicone either, so I had to remove the old stuff before cleaning the glass and applying tape. I added bumpers too. These are great to add because they ensure the glass won't squeeze out the silicone. I applied that along the edges, dropped in the sides, added a bead in the front, and installed the substrate tray. After sealing the interior and smoothing it out with my finger, the tape could be removed. I capped it off with two small top panels, one for the door track and the other to level out the frame. Once cured, I removed the anchoring tape, and from here we're back to the good footage. I'd add the tracks, doors, frame, and lids later in the process. It's much easier to hardscape without any of that, which brings us back to the buttress roots. There are many ways to create these features, such as soaking rags in concrete and draping them to give the appearance of a rippled tree. That method works well, but I wanted to take a more controlled approach and carve it by hand. In either case, it's best to create some type of armature to build from. I used foam because I have a ton of scraps from past projects I wanted to put to use. A mesh or lath probably would have been easier to work with though. I want to create an environment that's framed in by two buttress roots like this. The one on the left will jut out into the tank and create a hide, while the one on the right will be more of a background element. I started with the structure on the left, cutting foam strips to create the rough outline of a trunk. I taped it at first, but switched to hot glue. It stabilizes quickly, and I didn't want to embed tape under the concrete. With the trunk foundation established, I could move to the roots. I imagined these would be the focus, so I made them large and dramatic. Taking this time to make a proper armature is invaluable because it allows you to plan for a design before doing serious work. It will also reduce the amount of concrete needed, which will minimize weight and save money. However, some things can't be planned for, as you'll see throughout this build, so expect and embrace alterations as they come. Even at this stage, the vision was taking shape, and the second structure was easy to produce. In past builds where I used the same techniques, like Samson's Paludarium and Pistachio's Vivarium, I did all the work inside the tanks. That worked fine, but I knew it would be much easier to do that outside of the tank this time. That's when I got a few dry erase boards. Concrete won't stick to these even without a release agent, so they're perfect to build on. I just had to cut them down to match the dimensions of the tank. Tape was enough to hold most of it together, but I had to use 2x4s for the left. I double-checked the angle before screwing it to the table and the panel. All of this would allow me to carve the concrete with more precision. For this, I decided to go with the Buddy Roads vertical concrete mix, which is the same stuff I used for Samson and Pistachio, both of whom are still thriving. Anyway, this works by combining the concrete powder with the ramp primer and water. A paddle mixer is ideal for blending these together, but I didn't feel like getting mine out for these small batches. Instead, I mixed it by hand until the ideal consistency was achieved. It should end up kind of fluffy like Play-Doh. It's recommended to spray the foam with a diluted ramp for best adhesion. I say that because you'll see me do it here, but not at other times. I'm honestly unsure how much of a difference it actually makes. I began at the bottom and worked upward, creating a layer roughly 3/4 to an inch thick. This part is always really satisfying because it finally gives a real glimpse into how everything will look in the end. The early stages can be a bit finicky if the mix is too wet. Just wait for it to firm up or be prepared for non-stop adjustments until it stabilizes. I had to get these surfaces smooth before carving them. Lightly misting it here and there really helped with that. However, I wouldn't actually add the detail until it cured for an hour. I moved to the other tree in the meantime, repeating the same process. I enjoy using concrete because of how easily it holds natural details, whether through casting or carving. For this one, I began with clay carving tools and a trowel to clean up the edges. These roots would sit directly against the glass, so I wanted them to be as clean and sharp as possible. Buttress roots generally occur on trees with smooth bark, like the ceiba tree, which is what I used as a reference. Because of that, my process had to be deliberate. First, I'd carve away excess with my hand or a wet sponge to smooth the surface. It was a slow, hands-on process, but that's part of the appeal. If you need more time, just mist the surface to slow the curing process and keep working. That said, I couldn't add the fine details until it cured further. The ceiba tree has smooth bark, but it still features a distinct texture. To make this look authentic, I had to nail those details. I tried to use a wire brush at first, but found that a landscape pin and a piece of knitting mesh were best for creating the desired texture. I just had to periodically brush off the crumbs. Slowly but surely the texture began to feel right, so I went on to mimic natural imperfections like gashes and worn areas. Doing this on the second one was more challenging because of the intricate shape. I knew this would be the case, which is why I left the back of the melamine frame open. I wanted this part to be visible when installed, and I knew it would be next to impossible to carve if it were in the tank. The next day as the concrete cured, the color changed, and I was able to demold the pieces, leaving me with clean, flat backs ready for installation. Well, almost. Getting them into the tank was a tight squeeze, which I expected. What I didn't anticipate is that the silicone inside was stopping them from sitting flush, and this one was too tall. Thankfully, the concrete sands easily. I removed the material from the top, beveled the corners to clear the silicone, and smoothed the bottom edges, brushing off any leftover debris from carving. After those tweaks, they sat perfectly. That said, I wasn't thrilled with how much space one of the stumps took up. It was meant to be a hide for Sawyer, but in its current form, it wouldn't work. So I cut through it with an angle grinder to break off the back. While that improved the layout greatly, it needed more work. I glued it with foam to close it off, then filled it with concrete and carved it to resemble a hollowed, rotten section of a tree. Once cured, I sanded the surface to clean it up, finalizing the concrete work on the trees. Here's a closer look at the hide I just created. With the trees done, I moved to this open area on the back. I wanted to add a few background stones for visual depth and climbing spaces. Like the trees, I built them from foam and used mounting tape for a test fit. I liked the layout, so I transferred the pieces to a board and started the concrete process. This time I mixed the concrete wetter to create impressions with real rocks rather than carving. That made things go quicker, though I only made 2 stones because I was running low on concrete. The ability for this material to accept color through these water-based pigments is awesome. They make the task of bringing the sculptures to life a breeze and can be applied in a variety of ways. For the rocks, I began with a black wash to fill the crevices and add depth. Then I sprayed on other pigments, dabbing them with a sponge to blend the tones. I took a different approach with the trees. I began with a gray base coat, followed by black in the recessed areas and brown on the raised sections. After it all dried, a quick buff with steel wool brought out subtle highlights that really added dimension. Finally, I gave everything a thorough rinse to remove dust, loose pigment, and any leftover debris from construction. I also decided to fill this gap with expanding foam to make it easier to hide with silicone. I wanted a clean, seamless look, and seeing the sides of foam through the glass was not an option. I figured I could simultaneously solve both by squeegeeing silicone over the entire surface before pressing them in place. The rocks were really simple as well. This was when I realized I was going to have to carve part of the background outside of the tank. To do that, I simply coated a piece of foam, let it firm up, and randomly scraped it. This is an easy way to create a dirt or mud-like texture, which is exactly what I was aiming for. I also hit it with a wire brush to enhance the details. Once it dried, I tinted it to look the part. However, when I tried to install it, the rocks blocked it. I really only had two options here: remove the rocks or modify the panel. You can probably guess which one I picked. This edit solved the issue, but then I realized it would block access to the hide. I had to break off even more before patching the edges. The rest of the background didn't need a ton of detail since I planned to add vines for depth. Still, I needed a base, so I cut up and siliconed foam to the glass. After everything had cured for a few days, I applied concrete and carved the same muddy texture I had before. I wasn't planning to deal with a water bowl this early in the process, but I had leftover concrete from the background. So I used it to cover a stock bowl that would have looked totally out of place. However, if I were to do this again, I'd probably just make one from scratch, but this worked well enough. I colored the bowl and background to match the panel I installed behind the tree. First a dark wash to establish definition, and then various browns to mimic the appearance of dirt. However, this bright yellow is what truly tied it all together. As it dries, it gives the surface an aged, mossy appearance that just looks right. Even though the background was kind of flat, it looked dynamic enough. The vines were about to carry the rest of the burden. They'd add a lot of texture and depth if I could get the ideal configuration. I had to work in sections, even though I would have preferred to do it all at once. Typically I'd use epoxy to anchor them in, and I'd end up doing that later, but I went with superglue and rock wool for the time being. I knew the rock wool would naturally blend with the Scape without any additional work. The goal with these vines was to create a woven structure to add support for plants. I gotta be honest, I originally planned to carve these. At the time I was glad I didn't because of how well they blended into the scene and the amount of effort I saved by using natural elements. They'd later pose a problem I could have never predicted, which made me think otherwise. Till that happened, I blissfully arranged the vines and completed the water bowl. I'd say it's probably best to seal water bowls even if they're built around one like this. I'm using an aquarium-safe epoxy. I just mixed up the parts and painted it on. After 2 layers and the proper cure time, the bowl was ready to go. However, I noticed that the opening into the hide was still kind of small. I used a flush cut saw to remove what I could. All of these edits could have been avoided with better planning on my part, but I've never made anything like this before and was figuring it out as I went. At that point, I thought the hardscape was done, so I moved on to finishing the tank. I applied silicone to the frame and secured it to the top. While that cured, I made the screens using a process I've shown before. They're just basic window screens, frame pieces, corner connectors, and spline to lock in the mesh. Simple, effective, affordable, and easy to implement. The only thing is that they have to be bolted to the frame for snakes. I did that later on. What I haven't shown yet is that I was building a custom stand and canopy alongside the enclosure. I've made many before, but I wanted to challenge myself here both from a functional and aesthetic perspective. After all, it was going to be a centerpiece in a living room, and I wanted it to look as appealing as possible. Rather than build with 2x4s like I typically would, I instead used birch plywood. I knew I could get a cleaner look with these, while using less material in the process to minimize its footprint in the room. It wasn't all going to be plywood though. I cut down some pine finishing boards that I'd use for the face of the cabinets. It'd all be painted later, so it would match in the end. From there I went to the assembly table to account for the dowels. Dowel joinery is pretty easy, just keep the markings consistent and properly align the jig. Once the holes are drilled, simply add glue, insert the dowels, connect the pieces, and repeat the process. Just make sure your angles are correct before the glue sets. For the cabinet box, I used pocket holes to assemble the panels. Doing so takes a bit longer than simple butt joints, for example, but the added strength is well worth the time. I glued these as well before fastening them with cabinet screws. A feature I had to include in this stand was a recess to hide the tank's frame. The trim isn't appealing and would have taken away from the look. To solve that, I marked for the frame depth on the inside edges, attached a guide rail on the outside, and used a rabbiting bit on my router to create a recess. Then I cleaned the corners and removed the back with an oscillator. As you can see here, the tank will now sit flush with the frame completely hidden. I did this to the canopy as well. Next, I added various bracing boards to both the stand and canopy. These edge boards provided more surface area for the tank's frame to rest on, while the horizontal braces increased rigidity. Most of the tank's weight would be carried by the grooves in the plywood I just created, but the front required supporting face boards. These boards also gave me surface area to fasten dividers in the stand and a shelf in the canopy. I used a pegboard to create holes on the dividers for shelf pins as well. Finally, I glued on the tops. I had to break out the Bondo to hide the mistakes of an amateur woodworker. I also veneered the edges of the plywood before sanding it smooth and drilling holes for the lights. These turned out well enough. Now is the part that I wasn't quite as sure about. Nate wanted this painted a specific color to match furniture in his living room. I almost color matched it to use in a sprayer because I don't really care for spray paint, but I went for it.
It's only one thing to do now. Wish me luck.
In hindsight, I really wish I would have primed the surface, even though the paint claimed to have a primer built in. This took way more paint than it should have. In fact, I ran out of it mid-job and had to go to 3 different stores to find it, even though all of their sites said they had it. While I'm great with a brush, I'm not proficient with spraying. Fortunately, my makeshift spray booth pulled through and the finish was surprisingly good. Now, if only I'd worn the appropriate clothes because I was covered in overspray for the next week. I was aiming for an elevated design and decided to do something different with the shelves. I cut down project panels, which look similar to butcher block without the outrageous price tag. Instead of painting them, I stained them a dark brown. I thought this would create a sophisticated look when combined with the green stand. I also got a large piece I'd secure to the top of the canopy. Then I glued and nailed the lower shelves to the stand. I did the same for the top, but I fastened it from the inside with screws. Finally, I sealed everything with a few coats of polyurethane. At this point, I still hadn't made the doors. Luckily, I had this set of old ones from a different stand that I could modify to fit this one. I popped out the center panels, cut the frames down to size, and reassembled them using dowels like before. Then I glued in new MDF panels and gave everything a coat of paint. I made the ones for the canopy from scratch, but I lost all that footage too. Did I mention that this project was cursed? If you don't believe me yet, you will soon. I had all the hardware I needed from previous projects as well. I installed the hinges and mounted the doors, which felt great after spending so long on the rest of the stand. They immediately elevated the look, but what really sealed the deal were the knobs. Lizards on the bottom and bees on the top. At that point I thought this stand was finally done until something unfortunate happened. I didn't film whenever I modified this, but you can see these pieces here. I had to chop the top of it off because when I designed the stand, I did it based off of this frame here, and it's slightly shorter than the stock frame that the tank came with. But what I also realized is that this one is slightly wider than that one, which means that the tank won't even fit into the stand. While knowing the solution was actually simple, I created a guide for the circular saw to remove material from the sides. Then I took it outside to repaint, which kicked off a whole new set of problems. The heat of the day caused the corners to split. I had to fix those, sand everything, and repaint the entire stand for consistency. There were more setbacks that happened after this, which I didn't feel like filming. Just know that I had to sand and paint it 2 more times. That brings us back to the tank. I still had to wash the Scape and needed Nate's help to move it. That all went according to plan. Unfortunately, I wasn't going to be able to get his help when I'd actually need to move it onto my truck, so we put it onto a standing desk for now. I just want to jump in real quick to say that we actually planned to move the tank whenever we were doing this, but there were 2 additional setbacks. I ran into issues with the sponge filter for the false bottom. The first one arrived way too thin, which was my fault, but its replacement was false advertising. It also was way too thin. Thankfully, the third time was a charm. Then the UVB light arrived damaged and wouldn't turn on, so I had to replace it. As frustrating as those delays were, they turned out to be a blessing in disguise. They gave me time to discover and address an issue that otherwise would have gone unnoticed. I genuinely don't think I've had this many issues with a project because look, it's all scaped, looking beautiful, ready to send out, until I noticed that this stupid sawdust here, and back here just keeps showing up. I didn't think much of it at first. I thought, just settling from shipment and whatever, no big deal. Until about the second day I started getting weird. This is day 3 or day 4 of it showing up. Turns out that these branches are infested with powder post beetles. I can hear them chewing around in there. I doubt I can get it on camera. And I found an adult right here, which, I took care of him. He's not around anymore, but they're in there. I don't like that, and I'm in a wood shop nonetheless, so that's cool. But anyway, I gotta have to take these out and sterilize them, I guess. Oh yeah, and I accidentally chipped the front of the glass here when I was experimenting with some plants. These holes and the frass they left behind made more sense now. In fact, you can see it in a previous clip I took shortly after installing the vines. I really didn't want to remove them from the scape, but I had no choice. The only surefire way to eliminate them without chemicals would be to bake them. I wasn't sure when I'd have time to do that, so in the meantime I submerged them in a stock tank to drown the beetles. It actually worked too. After dispatching one, I found 4 others. I knew there was likely more, and if there were larvae living in the wood, I wouldn't be able to eliminate them without heat. Naturally, my oven is broken right now, so I had to use the grill. I lined it with foil to protect the vines from the flames, and got to cooking. It crept well past 200 degrees shortly after, where it remained for about 4 hours. I found 3 more on the foil as I moved the sanitized vines into a gasket box. I figured if any other beetles remained, this would keep them contained. I checked it periodically for frass, which would be my sign to cook them again. Thankfully nothing materialized, so it would appear my efforts were a success. I honestly don't know if I'm ever going to trust another piece of driftwood again, and I'm really hoping there aren't any beetles in my house, but all I can do now is move on. I did my best to recreate the original Scape, but it was a challenge. What I didn't show before is that I trimmed off the ends because I didn't want to put glue or rock wool in my grill. As a result, everything ended up smaller. And of course, the glue and rock wool weren't working as well as they had before. That's when I switched to aquarium epoxy, which is a more durable option anyway, though it's significantly more visible. Still, I managed to get things looking decent again, and days later there was no frass, which was a good sign. As much as I love using live moss, not every setup can support it. This time I used preserved moss to enhance the look and hide the epoxy. I attached it with hot glue, which works better than you may expect. Even though it's not living, this brought the same vibrancy to the design that you'd come to expect from moss. I also added some preserved lichen to decorate the trees. I was happy with how everything was coming together, so I moved on to tie up the loose ends, starting with the lids. I drilled through and locked them in with bolts. While I was at it, I installed the thermostat for the hotspot. I cut a hole in the screen to run that down the vine with zip ties. I later secured the probe to a piece of bark with stainless steel wire. Testing the canopy revealed a new issue. The bolts I just used to secure the screen kept it from sitting flat. A few holes solved that. Next, I tackled the false bottom. I kept it simple with a filter sponge, which is fine enough to retain substrate while allowing water to flow through. To make it possible to drain it without drilling the tank, I added a PVC standpipe with holes drilled at the base. After fitting this into the sponge, I secured everything with silicone because I don't want Sawyer to be able to knock anything loose. This cap will block access to the standpipe until it needs to be drained. I also covered the back to give it a more seamless look and address the chip in the glass. I recently had to repair a chip in my windshield, so I figured I might as well try this Rain-X epoxy. I wasn't sure if it would work because I've tried to use it on scratches in the past and wasn't pleased with the results. It was also a real challenge to use with the tank standing up. However, after curing it with a light, it worked well enough to fill the chip. It didn't really help with hiding it though. I guess it's better than nothing. With everything else in place, I installed the glass track. Mounting tape works surprisingly well for this and makes the task a breeze. To be honest, I would have trusted my measurements for the doors if things had gone smoother to this point. I was relieved when they did, but that relief was short-lived. The lock didn't fit. I was confused because I'd done this before until I realized the glass I was using now was thicker than usual, which meant there wasn't enough room for the lock. I tried another one, but it didn't work either, so I had to cut a thinner piece. I just took it as an excuse to use my new glass cutting table. It worked really well. The only remaining issue was the lock being too long. I trimmed it down before installing it. Next up was the canopy. Before placing it on the tank, I installed all the lights. A ceramic heat emitter for the hotspot, an LED plant light, and a UVB strip. The thing with snakes is that you gotta get creative with the plants. I wanted them to be able to retain water better than the rest of the environment so that the entire thing didn't need misted. My solution, wrapped the roots in sphagnum moss to hold water. Then to ensure it doesn't get displaced, secure it with mesh and zip ties. I chose hardy species, 2 of which will root directly onto the hardscape, and one that's large enough not to be tampered with. In time as they've established, they shouldn't be able to be messed with, but until then I loosely secured them to the vines.
That means I can finally get all of this out of my house, but I gotta pretty much do everything myself right now, so trust me, I've said my prayers because I can't have anything else going wrong this late in the process. I believe it's all gonna be alright though. After this, it's not my problem anymore. I'm only joking about that last part, just a little bit.
This was the part I'd been dreading because the tank is heavy. I knew that I could move it by myself, but I also knew that one wrong move could end in disaster. Luckily, the canopy was light work, fitting perfectly in the back seats. This is also where the standing desk came in handy. I moved it closer to the truck, raised it to the bed height, and with Alyssa securing the foam, I slid the tank in place. The stand then fit perfectly to its right. It honestly couldn't have went any better, and I didn't have to go alone after all. The only thing is that it was quite hot, and I didn't want anything getting damaged. So I wrapped both pieces in moving blankets before ratcheting them down and hitting the road. You better believe I drove it as carefully as I possibly could, and thankfully I got it to Nate's all in one piece. I was eager to get started, and first up was the substrate. I pre-mixed it back at home. It's a blend of reptile soil, bark, cocoa fiber, and charcoal. Adding this felt like a full circle moment because of how long I'd been working on this project. I started in February. No, not 6 months ago. February of 2024. It just kept getting put on the back burner for other things, and there were countless setbacks. Needless to say, I was more than ready for Sawyer, Nate, and Savannah to finally enjoy it. The substrate looked great, but the real transformation came with the details. The water bowl, seed pods, and bark chunks that created natural hides. No jungle setup would be complete without leaf litter either. I believe that with the addition of these, this environment contained within a glass box truly began to resemble what it was inspired by. This isn't really a bioactive setup, though I did add isopods. I say that because you still have to spot clean with snakes. Occasionally something may get left behind though, which is where a cleanup crew helps. Plus they'll break down the leaves and other organics, which will bring nourishment to the plants who needed some water after their journey.
We got it all hooked up. No issues, thankfully. We got the man here. Savannah's got him. Are you guys pleased?
Yes.
Look, it took so long that Nate had his quarter-life crisis.
It's all good. It's all good. It's all good.
All right, we're going to set him free.
You know what they say, red against black, like and subscribe. I couldn't help myself. Seriously, a lot of work went into this, so if you enjoyed it, let YouTube know. I joked earlier that I wish I hadn't been tasked with this project, but I'm genuinely glad that I made it. Moments like these always make the struggles seem so distant. Snakes are naturally inquisitive and curious, but in the wild they're so cryptic, it's often hard to fully appreciate those traits. Sawyer's still young and learning about the world, but understands that people aren't something to fear. That's the beauty of growing a connection with animals like this. You let them into your world, and they let you into theirs. Providing a naturalistic home like this makes all the difference too, because they'll exhibit a full range of behaviors. While this isn't a one-for-one representation of his natural habitat, it at least captures the essence of it. I did my best to carefully craft each detail to make him feel comfortable, and I think it shows. He settled in right away, cryptic basking beneath the leaves and exploring his new space. It was incredible to watch, but the moment that stood out to me was when he discovered his special hide. A few days later, Nate sent me this footage of him utilizing the background. I thought it was pretty cool to see, and he just looks right doing it, don't you think? Setbacks and all, I'm thankful for the experience. I've learned that the best growth doesn't happen in the easy seasons. It comes through challenge, and in any project, it's not the problems that define it, but how we work through them. Enjoy your jungle, Sawyer. If you enjoyed this video, I know you'll like the time I built a vivarium with a waterfall for my cane toad, and when I made a jungle oasis for my fire-bellied toads. As always, thank you so much for watching, and until next time, Serpa Squad, take care and peace.